Thank you very much for your wonderful, maybe summary of those discussion in Washington, D.C. So I have some questions to you. So starting from maybe the overview, once again, about the discussion in Washington or U.S. overhaul. So in these few years, discussion in economic security are rapidly gaining momentum in Japan, as evidenced by the enactment of the Economic Security Promotion Act, whereas U.S. doesn't have any such a move or act as you explained to us. And also further, the invasion of Russia to Ukraine seems to have heightened the discussion to the top priority level policy agenda here in Japan. But I feel the formation of those theories within academia and the response of private companies to those new environments are somewhat still in their infancy. So how would you describe the progress in the U.S. as the U.S. society as a whole? So I would appreciate you would describe the situation of the United States. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think you're right. If your question is beyond Washington policy world, which is very focused on these issues, whether you call them economic security or not, there's a lot of focus on all of these issues that I've been talking about that are, again, many of which overlap with the policies that Japan is pursuing or looking at in the economic security law. Beyond the Washington policy community, there is maybe either less focus or different focus on these issues. And, you alluded to the private sector. I would say our private sector, American major companies are, I think they understand that risks in the world have increased, and certainly if there was any doubt in the minds of many CEOs here in the U.S. about risks in the world, the combination of the kind of COVID restrictions and in China and the other tightening of policy in China, tightening of controls on information and their treatment of foreign businesses and so forth, that has created a new sense of risk about China in U.S. business. And there's been longstanding concern about technology theft and trade secrets theft. So it's sort of added to that concern. And so I do think that there is a stronger sense, a greater sense of risk awareness and sensitivity in the business sector. But obviously, the private sector also sees China as a huge market. If companies are selling into that market, they want to have access to that market, and don't like things like export controls that limit their access in certain areas. Obviously, the industry that's most in the crosshairs of this discussion is the semiconductor industry, where, again, I think the semiconductor industry understands that certain very high technology, highly advanced semiconductors are not going to be, that they cannot sell that to China, but they want to be able to sell everything that's less sophisticated than that, so they can make profits to be able to invest in R&D to build the next generation of advanced semiconductors. So in that industry in particular, there's a lot of mixed feelings at best, or even resistance to some of these, certainly the technology-related policies. And then in the broader business community, there's also, a concern that, I think there's a relief that the Biden administration has very clearly said we are not going to decouple or try to decouple from China more broadly. And there's relief that President Biden and Xi Jinping just met this week and seem to have stabilized relationship. But there is still a lot of concern about some of the specific policies to de-risk our relationship with China, and a concern that the administration is not, at the same time, not doing enough maybe to defend the interests of American business in China, which is again going back to the risks that these companies see on the ground there. So I would say the business community is sort of understanding, more sensitive to risk, but still a little resistant and uncomfortable with some of the things the U.S. government is doing. And in broader society, I think there's relatively little awareness about these risks. I mean, that's not unusual in sort of the national security world, unless American sons and daughters have to go and fight in a foreign war. Most Americans don't pay too much attention to these sorts of issues. There is concern about China, but some of that is just because politicians are making a lot of noise about that, and so they're responding to that. I think if they actually understood the costs and benefits of our engagement with China, they might have a little more mixed view. But I don't think, actually, I've said this in other contexts. I started working in policy work in the late 1980s when the U.S. and Japan had serious trade friction. And I actually think the American popular view of Japan was more negative than it is of China today. And that's partly because Japanese products were more visible back then, automobiles and cassette tape recorders and other things. And so I think it was easier for people to sort of target their anxiety or unhappiness with Japan. That's completely changed, by the way. Now Americans love Japan, so it's a completely changed perspective. But I'd say today, I sense that. I mean, seriously, I sense that on China, I don't know. It's sort of a soundbite, China, China, China. But actually, in people's daily lives, I don't think they experience a strong anti-China feeling. Most Americans, so they're not really quite as tuned into these economic security risks or concerns in the way that we are here in Washington. But that's a very generalized statement. Of course, there's a lot of detail below that. But, and academia, since you mentioned academia, I don't study academic literature. I mean, I occasionally see academic studies, but I don't routinely look at the literature in academia and do my own sort of assessment of what academics are thinking or writing about. So my sense is a little anecdotal or episodic, but I don't see a lot of academic literature on these economic security issues. There's some that stands out. I think I mentioned to you before, Hirai-san, that Daniel Dresner at Tufts University in Boston, he's been writing a lot about economic statecraft and sanctions for a long time. There's a guy named William Norris at Texas A&M University who writes a lot about Chinese economic statecraft. And there's some other people. I'm sure there are many people, but overall, there isn't a big academic focus on this set of issues. I'm sure there are younger scholars who are now very interested in the semiconductor export controls and so forth, but it's not a major topic of analysis in my impression.
So thank you very much. So let's move on to we would like to highlight the difference of those economic security between Japan and U.S. And then it was very interesting you're addressing too that your recognition of economic security is somewhat wider when you talk about with the reference to GPII or APEF thing. But I had an impression that your economic security argument is more confined or limited to coming from the threat of the Chinese economy or China itself. So could you describe or could you explain a little bit more about, or how do you feel? Because Japanese economic security is not only limited to the threat of China, but also a more overall risk of the disruption of supply chain coming from those Russia-Ukraine thing and a COVID-19 thing, all those kind of, or like a huge, big national disaster thing. So could you refer to that those differences once again?
No, it's a good point, and I do think that the core part of the economic security debate here is focused on China, and probably more heavily than there in Japan, because even the pandemic disruptions to our supply chains had a China relationship, because a lot of basic products like masks and ventilators and pharmaceuticals and other things are produced or at least assembled in China. So when those things were disrupted, there was a China dimension to that story. But certainly in the area of advanced technologies, as I mentioned, in those areas like semiconductors and quantum computing, biotechnology, I think the real concern, and it's been pretty clearly stated by many senior Biden administration officials, does relate to China as our sort of peer competitor in those areas, and that but here's a difference that I think makes the U.S. focus also narrower in this sense than Japan. I think when the Biden administration looks at those risks in particular, the technology-related risks, I think they're really pretty directly linking those risks to national security. They're worried about the use of these advanced chips in AI applications that could be used in military technologies, military weapons, and so forth. And so they would not, in a way, in some sense, maybe I didn't articulate this exactly the right way, but I think it's why in the U.S., I don't think we necessarily think of economic security first in this context. I think we think of it as national security. It happens to be that it's the economy that is delivering these technologies and so forth, but I think that's the lens they're looking through, is national security. Whereas in Japan, maybe you're a little more focused on the the risk to your economic competitiveness from certain things like, we're also concerned about those things. I think we're both concerned about both things, national security and competitiveness, but maybe relative emphasis here is a little bit more on the pure national security, and there it's more focused maybe on economic competitiveness and sort of continuity of economic activity and the risk to that from cyber attack or other problems. But no, these are, there are, I think that's a legitimate point. I guess, so in a way, I'm agreeing with you, but also explaining that I think the term economic security invokes something broader to us. That's why I agree with you, the policies that are focused on trying to protect ourselves against risks, those are more China-focused and more in line with what you call economic security. But I think when an American hears the term economic security, they think of something actually broader, because they're thinking about individuals' security of their livelihood, and they're thinking about maybe our manufacturing capability and other things. So yeah, these definitional questions are important. So I agree, there's some differences.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's very important to recognizing some nuance between the two countries, and then when we talk about economic security. So next one is to more historical difference. So you mentioned a very interesting comment on that, the comparison in economic or trade frictions in 1980s with Japan, 1990s in Japan. So some commentators, critics are saying that why economic security now? Now, what is the difference? And some are saying that the economic security was always the concern to U.S. society, as you mentioned in the 1980s, looking back to that period. Maybe Japan was a threat to U.S. government as well as U.S. society.
Right.
So what differentiated? What is differentiating of the current argument from that the 1980s? Your economic security, maybe there wasn't a term at that time, but the basic structure. What is the difference?
Yeah, well, again, I think in a strange way it makes the same point that I was trying to make, and I'm maybe not articulating this clearly, but I think in the 1980s and early 90s when we had this Boeki Masatsu, it was yes, we were concerned about Japan as a threat to our economic competitiveness. And as I say, this broad term, we didn't use this term, but broad concept of economic security, I think is what really we were worried about. We were not really worried about military threats because Japan was an ally and you know, it was a loyal ally and not doing things that would be threatening to us. So I think it sort of emphasizes the point that the difference then was it was more about economic competitiveness, whereas today I think the concern is more about national security, and national security leads you pretty quickly to China, not to Japan for sure. On the contrary, Japan is helpful to us in protecting our national security. So, you know, the China risks are of course they are also competitiveness risks. But I mean, and there are people here in America who are more worried about those competitiveness issues, and blame things on China. But I actually don't think the Biden administration is primarily focused on the competitiveness threat from China. I think they're focused on the national security threat, which of course has an economic dimension to it, and they want to have an economic. For example, manufacturing of advanced semiconductors, but they want that more because of the national security and military challenges from China. And then separately, yes, there is an impulse to create, you know, more American competitiveness, but I think it's not as related. These are nuances of difference. These are not clear delineations of different policy elements, but I think there is, you know, I think that's the big difference, that back then it was not a national security concern, it was more of a competitiveness concern with Japan, and today it's more of a pure national security concern.
Thank you. I think your comment gives us more clear understanding what the core of the economic security discussion in your country. So next one is you refer the defense or offense or protective side or those kind of the difference. I think it's a very good explanation or the way of understanding. But for maybe it could be only me, but I have an impression that your argument, especially in Washington's argument, is more leaning toward focusing on the protection side rather than promotion side. Is that the wrong impression, or is it because of that the administration?
That's right. Yeah. Thanks. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. So is that because of that the administration has some limited capacity to do something on the promotion side as freely as the protection side? How do you How do you feel? How do you explain that, if there is any difference between the two sides?
Well, I think first of all, you're right that I think that overall the focus is more on protection than promotion, but there are elements of promotion that are very central to their approach, including especially on these domestic investments in advanced semiconductors and in other advanced technologies, as well as in electric vehicles and other green energy solutions. And that is where the promotion activity is mostly focused. I think where it is less robust is in promoting, as I say, our preferred rules and norms through trade policies and others. That's one point. And the other point is that even in terms of allied cooperation, I think more of the focus is on protection than promotion. I think the Biden administration has spent more effort trying to get Japan to support or to align its export controls on advanced semiconductors or machinery to make semiconductors than it has spent on trying to promote joint development of new technologies. Of course, there is a lot of that activity too. There's joint R&D. But that has been previously existing even before this recent concern about China and so forth. And I often say the problem with the joint promotion with allies and partners is that even if we are very aligned with each other on our concern about these issues, and we share interests and values even, we are competitors in the marketplace. So the closer you get, so if you think of development, as a spectrum of basic ideas and research, going through, development and turning these ideas into commercial products, the closer you get to the market, the more competitive we are with each other, and the harder it is to promote joint efforts, realistically. Whether it's U.S. and Japan or Korea or other countries that are competing with each other in the marketplace in a friendly competition, and not in a national security competition, in a kind of friendly economic competition. So I think promotion is inherently, in that sense, is harder. It's easier at the research end of the spectrum, but it gets harder and harder. And so I think, of course, they're doing some things, and I mentioned in the 2+2 document that there's even talk of joint promotion activities. But I think the energy or the stronger impulse and activity of the administration across these issues is more on the protect side, and somewhat, but not as strong on the promotion side.
So thank you. And on maybe the topics is relative to the defense side, but one of the interesting topics is the debate on the effectiveness of economic sanctions. And I understand you were involved in the CSIS report in your previous pause. So I think there have been so many, and in that report, I understand in the rough summary is like there haven't been many cases in which economic sanctions have been very effective in the past. So what kind of takeaways did you get? Well, what are your expectations for research in this field? And how do you think this will be reflected in actual policy formations?
Yeah. Well, honestly, that work was not done by me, but by other scholars at CSIS, and there have been others in other think tanks who have written about these subjects. But I think you're correct that the conclusion of those studies has largely been that sanctions have generally not been effective if you look back historically. There are a few exceptional cases. Arguably, in the South Africa case, there was some progress. Arguably, in the Iran nuclear case, there was at least some contribution of sanctions to the the earlier deal on nuclear issues, the six-party, or no, whatever it was called, the not the six-party side, that's the North Korean one, the group of countries that agreed on a deal with Iran, before Trump in the Obama administration. And so there are some examples, counterexamples, but in general, sanctions have not been proven to work very effectively. And actually, even in the current Russia-Ukraine situation, obviously there's been a lot of attention given to those issues. I think one of my colleagues did write a paper about the effectiveness of the Russia, or the lessons from the Russia sanctions, and he concluded, sanctions are really designed to do three things, which are to deter, to destabilize, and to degrade another country's capabilities. And in the case of Russia, clearly the Western sanctions did not deter Russia from its action against Ukraine. It arguably did not destabilize the Russian economy, but it could, over time, still have an effect on degrading, meaning reducing the capability or capacity of Russia to build, advanced things, or especially military things. And so that's still to be determined. The jury is still out on that question. But overall, the conclusion was, even those sanctions, which are unprecedented in their scale, have not really significantly affected Russia's thinking or actions. So, but again, there are other people who have done more work on this. I mentioned Daniel Dresner before at Tufts. I would recommend you look at some of his work in this area. He's written a couple of books about this subject, and there are others. And there's some very smart people at think tanks who are trying to study this. Although I must say, overall, the sanctions literature is not very deep, especially on the economics of sanctions. There's been, there's been some work on the kind of mechanics of sanctions, the sort of legal and regulatory aspects of sanctions, and some analysis of the high foreign policy use of sanctions. But the sort of economic analysis of sanctions is pretty thin, actually, is my impression, both in academia and in think tanks.
So unfortunately, the time is running out. So the last question, or last comment, is I would like to ask you is there any add to about the future of the what this economic security debate is planning out from now on? You also mentioned about those maybe a perspective about the future U.S. China relation is still maybe confrontational, and also it is to our side about the negative thing about the U.S. society as a whole on the trade, and we are looking forward to having you back on the CPTPP or a more greater relationship on the those trade policy fronts. So is there anything to add about those, any perspective on those future of this economic security policy areas?
Well, again, I'm just taking it backwards on the trade issues. Again, I'm not very optimistic in the near term about a more robust trade policy. Definitely do not believe that the United States, is going to be rejoining CPTPP. Maybe never, I'm afraid. But no. To be a little more optimistic, I do think eventually the United States will come back to a more traditional trade policy, updated, approach, but something more familiar to you from the past, because I think it's in our national interest, and we have to be part of these high standard, comprehensive trade negotiations, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. So I think we will be back eventually, but I'm not predicting that's going to happen in the next year. And if Trump gets reelected, I think it definitely will not happen during his term. But if anybody else gets elected president, then I think there's more hope for something like a reversion to traditional trade policy. And then on the other issues, I definitely think we are on a clear course to more targeted controls on advanced technologies. I think you'll see further tightening of the advanced semiconductor rules, and probably new rules in these other areas like quantum computing and biotechnology that are particularly of concern. AI-related technologies, more generally, I think will be things that the U.S. is going to, whether under Biden or Trump or anybody else, I think those are going to continue to be targets of great scrutiny and policy action, including restrictions and controls for the indefinite future until China changes. I mean, if China, after Xi Jinping, becomes more like the old China that we knew under Deng Xiaoping or Zhu Rongji, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the Japanese pronunciation of those more reform-oriented Chinese leaders in the past. But if China becomes more like that again, then this may change. But as long as it's China like Xi Jinping's China, then I think it's going to continue this effort to tighten control.
So could you one more add of the future perspective about U.S.-Japan relationships, especially? You mentioned about the 2+2 EPCC thing, but also any other areas. What kind of your expectation about the involvement of the U.S.-Japan relationship in this area?
Yeah, I think it will remain very strong. We're going to have, I think, a lot of joint activity. I mean, I remind people, and I don't want to embarrass our METI friends who are more concerned about the impact of some of the U.S. actions on the private sector and on business interests. But the reality is that METI was way ahead of the United States in thinking about these issues. I mean, I remember 10 years ago, one of your colleagues came and gave me a very nice PowerPoint briefing about various technology risks, from cyber theft, from export of sensitive technologies, from deemed exports, through the laboratories and universities in Japan or the U.S. And I think METI was way ahead of the United States in thinking about these issues and trying to come up with, with responses and policy responses. So I think Japan's been kind of a leader in this area, even though it took you longer to, pass an economic security law, and you still have elements of your system that are not fully robust. I mean, in the sense of, security clearances. I mean, I know there are other issues you're still working on, but in terms of the kind of mindset about these issues, Japan's been ahead. So I think in that sense, now that the U.S. has kind of caught up with Japan in being concerned about these, especially technology-related issues, I actually think that we will be working even more closely together, especially on the protection side, but to some extent on the promotion side, especially at that sort of earlier R&D phase.
Thank you. So that's all from me.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Goodman and Mr. Hirai. I'm so impressed by the discussion. And we will now move on to the question and answer session. I would like to pick up the one question and one request. This question and request is more informal and frankly. So the first question is, I know you have many METI friends, you know a lot on METI. So, how do you think the METI's role on economic security?
Yeah. Well, as I said, I think METI has been far ahead of, I think, other agencies in Japan, although I don't know all the agencies in Japan who have been working on these issues so well. But I know that METI has been a leader in thinking about these issues, especially, again, related to technology leakage questions. And, you know, I understand that's a big deal for Japan because, and for METI, because, you know, when I studied Japan in the 1980s, when I was in graduate school, you know, we read the famous book METI and the Japanese Economic Miracle by Chalmers Johnson and other books about how METI was the champion of industrial policy and supporting Japanese companies. And you still have that responsibility to promote the interests of Japanese business. So against that background, I actually think METI has been quite bold in talking about economic security policies that, frankly, you know, could restrict the business of Japanese companies. So there's a kind of a dual personality that METI has. You know, just like our Commerce Department, which has also a trade promotion and a security personality. So it's difficult, but I think METI has done a good job of balancing the two. And I'm not saying that just because you're METI friends. That's genuinely my impression from over here. And so you know, it's been a leader on these issues.
Yeah, thank you so much. So. Finally, and one more request is that could you give an encouraging message to young officials in METI?
Well, METI is a great organization, and you're doing such interesting, important work. I always say to young people in the U.S. system as well, or people who are not in government, I always say that young people should have a career in government, because working on issues like the ones we've been talking about is incredibly important and rewarding. And even if you're just a small part of a big policy issue, you're making a bigger contribution to your country's development and security and prosperity. And that's a really powerful feeling. I miss being in government. I sometimes joke that, you know, like a baseball player, you want to be in the major leagues or the Japan League, right? You want to be in the top division. You don't want to be in the minor leagues and the AAA baseball. You want to be and I feel a little bit like I'm in the minor leagues, being in a think tank. So government work is great, and I think METI is at the cutting edge of many of the most important issues in the world. By the way, can I just say one thing? My new boss at the Council on Foreign Relations is Mike Froman, who's very well known to people in Japan, including at METI, as the former U.S. trade representative who negotiated TPP. And Mike is now the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he has told his staff, all of us, that he wants to emphasize 4 priorities on big themes that are really important issues in today's world. He wants to continue doing everything broad that CFR is doing, but he specifically wants to identify, highlight, and do more work in 4 areas. And those 4 areas are China, technology, climate change, and these economic policy issues. In other words, really how the U.S. restores its economic leadership in the world. And so all of those issues, you know, METI is working on. So you're working on the most important issues in the world, at least as measured by, you know, whether the head of a major think tank in the U.S. thinks, you know, those are the important issues. So I think these are, you know, METI's a great place to work, and I encourage young people to stay and keep contributing.
Yeah, thank you for your encouraging and insightful message. I'm glad to hear that. Now it's time to close the webinar. I would like to thank Mr. Goodman and Mr. Hirai for their excellent presentation, comments, and discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity. Have a good day, everyone.